Look down at your hands and imagine what it feels like to pick cotton until your fingers literally bleed and your back feels like it is permanently broken, only to be told at the end of the grueling harvest season that you somehow owe the man who owns the land more money than when you started. You are standing in the suffocating humid heat of Phillips County, Arkansas in the autumn of 1919, and you are trapped inside an incredibly brutal economic system that is slavery in absolutely everything but its official legal name. The American Civil War has been over for more than half a century, the blood has dried on the battlefields, and the history books have proudly declared that emancipation was achieved, but out here in the endless flat green fields of the Mississippi River Delta, the proclamation is nothing more than a worthless piece of paper blowing in the wind. The system that rules this land is called sharecropping, and it is a perfectly engineered mathematical trap designed specifically to keep the black farmers of the South in a state of perpetual, inescapable debt peonage. You work the land, you plant the seeds, you endure the brutal sun to harvest the crop, but the wealthy white planter owns the dirt beneath your feet, he owns the dilapidated wooden cabin you sleep in, he owns the general store where you are legally forced to buy your food and tools at insanely inflated prices, and most importantly, he dictates exactly what your cotton is worth at the end of the year. He keeps the books in his office, and you as a black sharecropper are absolutely not allowed to look at those ledgers. If you try to argue the math, if you demand an itemized receipt for your year of labor, if you try to take your bales of cotton to a different market in a different town to get a fair price, you are violently beaten, your family is threatened, or you simply disappear into the muddy waters of the river in the dead of night. It is a completely rigged game of economic strangulation, and for decades the black farmers of Arkansas have suffered under its crushing weight in terrified silence, knowing that the local law enforcement and the courts are entirely controlled by the very same planters who are robbing them blind. But 1919 is not just any ordinary year in American history. The entire world has just been completely shattered and violently rebuilt by the mechanized horrors of the First World War. Thousands of young black men from the Mississippi Delta were drafted into the United States military, handed a Springfield rifle shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to the muddy blood-soaked trenches of France, and explicitly told by their government to fight and die for the sacred concept of global democracy. They fought incredibly bravely, they watched their friends get blown apart by artillery, and critically they were treated with respect and basic human dignity by the French citizens they were defending. And then the war ended and they came home. They took off their honorable military uniforms, they put their worn-out dusty overalls back on, and they looked around at the brutal oppressive reality of the American South with entirely new eyes. They had just killed men in Europe to defend freedom, and they were absolutely no longer willing to be treated like subhuman property in their own backyards. A profound, massive psychological shift is rippling through the black community of Phillips County like an electric current. These returning veterans and the exhausted farmers who stayed behind are realizing a terrifying but necessary truth: nobody is coming to save them. The federal government in Washington simply does not care. The local sheriffs are the ones actively enforcing the oppression, and the system will never willingly give up its free labor. If they want to survive, if they want their children to have a future where they actually own the fruits of their own agonizing labor, they have to organize, they have to unite, and they have to fight the corrupt system from the inside using the laws of the United States. Deep in the rural heart of the county, a dangerous revolutionary idea begins to take root, whispered secretly in the cotton fields and discussed in hushed, terrified tones on front porches long after the sun goes down. It is an idea so terrifying to the white power structure that simply speaking the word aloud could easily get a man lynched from a nearest pine tree. The idea is unionization. A black man named Robert L. Hill, a charismatic, deeply driven organizer with a bold vision for economic liberation, helps to establish the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. This is not just a social club or a church group, it is a highly structured, deeply secretive, and incredibly brave economic resistance movement. The union leaders travel through the rural districts telling the sharecroppers that they do not have to silently accept the planters' fraudulent ledgers anymore. They tell them that they can pull their meager pennies together, hire a highly reputable white attorney from the capital city of Little Rock, and legally sue the massive plantation owners in federal court to force them to provide honest financial settlements for the year's cotton crop. It is a brilliantly peaceful, legally sound strategy designed to beat the white elite at their own game using the American legal system that the white elite claim to revere. But in the Jim Crow South, black economic independence is not viewed as a legal strategy, it is viewed as a direct act of treason and a violent race war just waiting to happen. The wealthy white plantation owners, the corrupt sheriffs, and the local politicians begin to hear whispers and rumors of these secret union meetings, and a deep paranoid panic begins to spread rapidly through the white community. They know with absolute certainty that if the sharecroppers successfully unionize and demand fair market prices for their cotton, the entire economic foundation of the Delta, the very foundation that makes the white elite incredibly wealthy and powerful, will collapse overnight. They begin to actively hunt for the union leaders, employing black informants, tapping into the local gossip networks, and quietly preparing for a massive violent crackdown to crush the movement before it can reach the courthouse. The tension in Phillips County becomes completely unbearable, acting like a tightly coiled steel spring just waiting for a single mistake to violently snap and tear the community apart. On the dark autumn night of September 30th, 1919, the air is thick and cool as roughly 100 black sharecroppers, men and women, gather quietly at the modest wooden hoop spur church located at a lonely, desolate rural crossroads surrounded by dense woods and unharvested fields. This is a critical, pivotal union meeting. They have pulled their absolute last pennies collecting the cash needed to officially retain the services of Ulysses S. Bratton, a well-known and courageous white attorney, who has agreed to take their incredibly dangerous case and sue the wealthiest planters in the county. The atmosphere inside the small church is a highly combustible mixture of intense religious faith, desperate hope, and sheer absolute terror. They know that if the local white authorities find out they are gathering in the dark to hire a lawyer, they will be met with extreme immediate violence. Because of this terrifying, undeniable reality, a small group of black Union members armed with old hunting shotguns and small caliber rifles are stationed strategically outside the church in the pitch-black darkness, acting as armed sentries to protect the peaceful meeting from the white vigilante mobs that have been routinely terrorizing the area for months. Inside the church, the men and women are kneeling on the wooden floorboards praying fervently, they are singing soft spiritual hymns, and they are listening intently to the Union leaders explain the legal strategy that will finally bring them the economic freedom they have bled for all their lives. The flickering kerosene lamps cast long dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls, illuminating the exhausted, hopeful faces of people who have been completely crushed by an unfair system for generations. But outside, in the pitch-black silence of the rural Arkansas night, the nightmare is quietly rolling up the dirt road. A car carrying local white law enforcement officers, including a deeply racist and notoriously violent deputy named W.A. Adkins, turns off its headlights and slowly creeps toward the Hoop Spur Church, engine idling quietly. The white authorities have been tipped off by an informant about the secret Union meeting, and they have come to intimidate, to terrorize, and to physically crush the organization before the sharecroppers can officially hire their attorney in the morning. The white officers park the car in the dark a short distance from the church and step out onto the dusty road, their hands resting heavily on the grips of their sidearms. They can hear the soft melodic singing coming from the glowing church windows. They begin to move stealthily through the thick brush, trying to completely encircle the building and catch the Union members by surprise to trap them inside. But the black sentries stationed in the dark perimeter are alert. They see the dark shadows moving aggressively in the tree line. They hear the unmistakable snap of dry twigs under heavy leather boots. What happens next in the complete, unforgiving darkness of that rural crossroads is the single chaotic spark that will instantly ignite one of the most horrific, heavily suppressed, and brutally violent massacres in the entire history of the United States. Without any verbal warning, without any official demands for surrender, the heavy dark silence of the night is suddenly shattered by the deafening roar of gunfire. It is completely impossible to know exactly who pulled the trigger first, whether it was a nervous white deputy looking to start a massacre or a terrified black sentry defending his community from what he believed was a lynch mob, but within a matter of seconds the quiet dirt road explodes into a chaotic, terrifying shootout. Bright orange muzzle flashes light up the woods like violent lightning, illuminating the panicked faces of the men hidden in the brush. The black sentries, vastly outgunned but fighting for their absolute survival, return fire toward the blinding flashes in the dark. The gunfire rips violently through the thin wooden walls of the church, sending the men and women inside diving desperately to the floorboards, screaming in absolute terror as bullets shatter the windows and extinguish the kerosene lamps, plunging the entire congregation into complete, terrifying darkness. In the chaotic, blinding crossfire, Deputy W.A. Adkins is struck solidly by a bullet and falls dead into the Arkansas dirt, and another white man is severely wounded, bleeding heavily into the grass. The remaining white officers, completely shocked and entirely unprepared for the reality that the black sharecroppers actually fired back, scramble frantically into their car and speed away blindly into the night, leaving their dead deputy lying in the dust. The silence that slowly returns to Hoop Spur is heavier and infinitely more terrifying than anything these people have ever experienced in their entire lives. The black men and women slowly, cautiously crawl out of the bullet-riddled church, looking down at the dead white officer bleeding in the dirt road, and they know with absolute bone-chilling certainty that their lives are effectively over. They know that in the Jim Crow South, the death of a white law enforcement officer at the hands of black men, no matter the context, no matter the obvious necessity of self-defense, will be answered with a violence so overwhelming, so indiscriminate, and so biblical that it will completely consume the entire county by morning. The Union members scatter blindly into the night, running back to their dilapidated cabins, grabbing their terrified children, and fleeing desperately into the dense, impenetrable cane brakes and freezing swamps that border the massive Mississippi River, praying to a silent God that they can disappear before the sun comes up. They know the posse is coming. What they do not know, what they cannot possibly imagine, is that the posse will not just be the local sheriff and a few angry local farmers. The death of Deputy Adkins will be immediately and ruthlessly weaponized by the white power structure to legally justify a massive, highly coordinated military-style campaign of ethnic cleansing designed to completely eradicate the Union and ensure that black sharecroppers never again dare to demand their economic freedom. The governor of Arkansas, the wealthy planters, and the entire white political establishment are about to unleash a literal heavily armed army upon the quiet cotton fields of Phillips County, a devastating tidal wave of blood and fire that will stain the soil of the Delta for 100 years and leave hundreds of American citizens rotting in unmarked mass graves while the entire nation conveniently looks the other way. The crisp, freezing air hanging over the Mississippi River Delta in the early morning hours of October 1, 1919, carried the terrifying sound of a world descending into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The news of Deputy Adkins' death at Hoop Spur Church had spread through the white community of Phillips County like a catastrophic wildfire, instantly mutating from a chaotic midnight shootout into a completely fabricated, highly coordinated narrative of a massive, armed black uprising. The white power structure, the plantation owners, the politicians, and the local law enforcement did not just call for an investigation, they sounded the alarm for a full-scale race war. They sent urgent, frantic telegrams to the governor of Arkansas, Charles Bruff, claiming that thousands of heavily armed black sharecroppers were preparing to slaughter every white citizen in the county. They demanded immediate military intervention, painting a horrific, entirely fictional picture of an organized black army marching on the town of Elaine. Governor Bruff, a man deeply entrenched in the white supremacist political machine of the South, did not hesitate or ask for corroborating evidence. He immediately requested federal troops from the War Department and personally rode a special train into Phillips County, effectively giving the highest level of state sanction to the bloodbath that was about to unfold. But the white citizens of Phillips County did not wait for the federal army to arrive. By dawn, the local authorities had effectively deputized a massive, uncontrolled civilian militia. Hundreds, and eventually thousands, of heavily armed white men began pouring into the county from neighboring towns, from across the river in Mississippi, and from as far away as Tennessee. They arrived in cars, on horseback, and on trains, carrying hunting rifles, shotguns, and military-issue sidearms. This was not a localized riot. It was a regional invasion. The white mob, fueled by a terrifying cocktail of deep-seated racial hatred, economic anxiety, and the deliberately manufactured fear of an impending black insurrection, began a systematic, heavily armed sweep of the rural countryside. They did not target specific individuals involved in the Hoopspur shootout. They targeted the entire black population of Phillips County. The hunting had officially begun. In the dense, freezing cane brakes and the treacherous, muddy swamps bordering the Mississippi River, the black sharecroppers who had fled the church were huddled in the freezing mud, terrified and desperate. They had heard the roar of engines and the sharp crack of rifles echoing across the flat cotton fields all night. By sunrise, the reality of their situation became horrifyingly clear. They were surrounded by an army of thousands of heavily armed men actively searching for them. Men, women, and children tried to remain perfectly still in the freezing water, knowing that the slightest movement or sound would draw the attention of the white patrols that were systematically combing the woods. The mob operated with terrifying, military-style efficiency. They set up armed roadblocks on every major highway and dirt road leading out of the county, ensuring that absolutely no black citizen could escape the quarantine zone. They began moving from cabin to cabin, kicking down the flimsy wooden doors, dragging terrified families out of their beds, and demanding information about the Union and the uprising. When the sharecroppers, genuinely confused and terrified, pleaded ignorance, the mob responded with overwhelming violence. Homes were ransacked, meager belongings were destroyed, and any black man who dared to look a white man in the eye or question their authority was beaten or shot on the spot. The scale of the violence rapidly escalated from intimidation to outright massacre. The white mob, acting with absolute impunity, began executing black citizens in the cotton fields, on the dirt roads, and in the swamps. Witnesses later describe horrific scenes of black men being chased down by men in cars and shot in the back as they ran for their lives. There were reports of black families being burned alive inside their cabins. The violence was entirely indiscriminate. It did not matter if you were a Union member, a World War I veteran, a woman, or a child. If you were black and you were in Phillips County, you were a target. The local authorities made absolutely no attempt to stop the slaughter. In fact, many of the deputies and local officials were actively leading the death squads. The most terrifying aspect of the Elaine Massacre was not just the sheer brutality of the violence, but the complete and total collapse of the rule of law. The state had effectively handed over the power of life and death to a mob of heavily armed, racially motivated vigilantes. And the nightmare was about to reach an entirely new level of horror. On the morning of October 2nd, a massive contingent of over 500 heavily armed federal troops, battle-hardened veterans of the First World War from the 3rd Division, arrived in Phillips County on special trains. They were commanded by Colonel Isaac Jenks, a man who had been briefed on the fabricated narrative of a massive black uprising. The black citizens of Phillips County, many of whom had served in the military themselves, saw the arrival of the federal troops and felt a brief, desperate surge of hope. They believed that the United States Army, the institution they had fought for in Europe, had finally arrived to restore order, disarm the white mob, and protect them from slaughter. They were catastrophically wrong. The federal troops did not disarm the white vigilantes. They actively collaborated with them. Colonel Jenks, operating under the assumption that he was putting down an armed rebellion, deployed his soldiers across the county, setting up machine gun nests at major intersections and sending heavily armed patrols into the swamps and cane brakes. The federal troops, rather than acting as a neutral peacekeeping force, became the heavily armed shock troops of the white supremacist agenda. They systematically rounded up hundreds of black citizens, dragging them out of the swamps and their homes at gunpoint, and herded them into makeshift concentration camps. These camps, often located in local schools or stockades, were heavily guarded by federal soldiers with bayonets fixed. Inside these camps, the black citizens were subjected to brutal interrogations, physical abuse, and horrific conditions. They were denied food, water, and basic medical care. The authorities, desperate to extract confessions that would validate their fabricated narrative of a black uprising, resorted to torture. Men were beaten relentlessly, subjected to mock executions, and choked with muddy water until they signed pre-written confessions admitting to organizing an armed insurrection against the white citizens of Phillips County. The federal troops, rather than stopping the torture, facilitated it by providing the secure locations and the heavily armed guard necessary to carry out these horrific acts without any interference. The presence of the United States Army did not stop the massacre. it industrialized it. The troops provided a terrifying veneer of official state sanction to the violence, making it clear to the black population that the entire weight of the federal government was aligned with the white mob. The death toll from the Elaine Massacre is completely unknown, and it will likely remain a dark secret buried in the muddy soil of the Mississippi Delta. Official records at the time claimed that perhaps 20 to 25 black citizens and 5 white men were killed. However, oral histories from the survivors, investigations by courageous black journalists like Ida B. Wells, and modern historical research suggest that the true number of black victims is exponentially higher, likely ranging from 100 to several hundred men, women, and children. It is widely considered to be one of the deadliest incidents of racial violence in the entire history of the United States. Bodies were left to rot in the fields, dumped into the Mississippi River, or buried in unmarked mass graves in the swamps. The white citizens of Phillips County, having successfully crushed the Union and murdered hundreds of their neighbors, returned to their homes and their businesses completely untouched by the law. Not a single white person was ever charged, arrested, or prosecuted for any of the murders committed during the Elaine Massacre. The complete lack of accountability sent a chilling, unmistakable message to the black sharecroppers of the South. If you attempt to organize, if you attempt to demand fair treatment, or if you even dare to hire a lawyer, you will be met with overwhelming, state-sanctioned violence, and your murderers will walk free. But the injustice of Elaine did not end with the mass graves or the silence of the federal government. The white power structure, having successfully executed the physical massacre, now turned its attention to the legal massacre. They needed to solidify their completely fabricated narrative of a black uprising, and they needed to make a horrific, public example of the surviving Union leaders to ensure that no black citizen in Arkansas would ever again dare to challenge the economic status quo. They decided to use the very legal system that the sharecroppers had tried to access for justice as the final weapon of their destruction. The aftermath of the Elaine Massacre would shift from the bloody cotton fields to the pristine, wood-paneled courtrooms of the Arkansas justice system, where a series of highly publicized, completely rigged show trials would take place. These trials were designed not to uncover the truth, but to legally execute the victims of the massacre and officially enshrine the lie of the black uprising in the historical record. The legal battle that followed would become one of the most significant and fiercely fought civil rights cases in American history, reaching all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States and testing the very fundamental core of the American justice system. The physical slaughter in the muddy cotton fields of Phillips County had finally burned itself out, but the terror was only shifting its shape, transforming from the raw chaotic violence of the mob into the cold calculated machinery of the Arkansas legal system. The white power structure, having murdered hundreds of innocent black citizens and completely crushed the progressive farmers and household union, now realized they had a massive logistical and political problem on their hands. The sheer scale of the bloodbath, the bodies washing up on the banks of the Mississippi River, the smoldering ruins of the sharecroppers' cabins could not simply be swept under the rug without a coherent official narrative to justify the absolute carnage. They needed to legally validate their fabricated story of a massive black uprising, and the only way to do that was to parade the surviving victims through a courtroom and legally sentence them to death, officially rubber-stamping a lynching under the sacred banner of the American justice system. In the days immediately following the massacre, the Phillips County Jail in the town of Helena became an absolute nightmare of humans suffering an overcrowded, suffocating hellhole where hundreds of terrified black men, women, and children were packed into tiny cells meant to hold a fraction of that number. These people had just survived being hunted by heavily armed militias and federal troops. They had watched their friends and family members get shot down in the dirt, and now they were locked behind iron bars, completely at the mercy of the exact same men who had organized the hunting parties. The white authorities, led by local sheriffs and members of the so-called Committee of Seven, an extrajudicial group of wealthy planters and businessmen who had taken absolute dictatorial control over the county, desperately needed confessions. They needed signed documents stating that the black sharecroppers had intentionally started the violence and were actively plotting to murder the white population. When the prisoners naturally refused to confess to a completely fabricated conspiracy, the authorities resorted to medieval levels of physical torture. Deep inside the damp concrete walls of the Helena jail, out of sight of the national press and the federal government, black men were systematically dragged from their overcrowded cells and subjected to horrific violence. They were violently whipped with heavy leather straps embedded with metal, they were suffocated with formaldehyde-soaked rags pressed over their faces until they lost consciousness, and they were subjected to terrifying electric shocks using rudimentary crank generators. The screams of the tortured men echoed through the jail day and night, a psychological weapon designed to completely break the spirit of anyone who dared to maintain their innocence. Under this unimaginable physical and psychological agony, men began to sign whatever pieces of paper the white authorities thrust in front of them, falsely confessing to crimes they never committed simply to make the unbearable pain stop. With these completely coerced, fraudulent confessions in hand, the white establishment hastily convened a grand jury to formally indict the survivors. This grand jury was a complete and absolute mockery of the justice system, composed entirely of white men, many of whom had personally participated in the armed posses that had scoured the county executing black citizens just days prior. To no one's surprise, this heavily compromised grand jury rapidly returned sweeping indictments against 122 black men, charging them with murder and insurrection. Out of this massive group, the authorities specifically selected 12 men, including prominent union members and highly respected figures within the black community, to be the ultimate sacrificial lambs. These 12 men, who would soon become internationally known as the Elaine 12, were specifically targeted for the electric chair, their state-sanctioned executions, designed to be the bloody, terrifying climax of the white supremacists' campaign of total control. The trials of the Elaine 12 began in early November 1919, just 1 month after the massacre, and the atmosphere surrounding the Phillips County Courthouse in Helena was practically identical to the atmosphere of a public lynching. Thousands of heavily armed white men wearing their sidearms openly gathered on the courthouse lawn and packed into the sweltering courtroom, staring with absolute raw hatred at the black defendants sitting in the dock. The armed mob made their demands incredibly clear. They wanted these men sentenced to death immediately, and if the legal system failed to deliver the electric chair, the mob would simply drag the defendants out into the street and hang them from the nearest tree. The judge presiding over the trials made absolutely no effort to clear the armed mob from his courtroom or ensure a fair proceeding, effectively allowing the threat of mob violence to completely dictate the entire legal process. The court-appointed defense attorneys assigned to represent the black defendants were local white lawyers who were either deeply sympathetic to the mob or absolutely terrified of being murdered themselves if they mounted a genuine defense. These defense attorneys did not interview a single witness, they did not cross-examine the state's witnesses, they did not challenge the violently coerced confessions, and they did not even allow their own clients to take the stand to testify in their own defense. The entire trial process was a breathtakingly fast, heavily choreographed theater of death. The prosecutors simply presented the fraudulent confessions, claimed the white deputies were acting in self-defense against a massive black conspiracy, and rested their case. The jury, which of course was composed entirely of white men, many of whom were deeply connected to the plantation economy, did not even bother to leave the courtroom to deliberate. For some of the defendants, the jury returned a guilty verdict and a sentence of death by electrocution in less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes to completely sign away a man's life, 5 minutes to legally validate a massacre, 5 minutes to demonstrate that in the Jim Crow South the scales of justice were heavily weighted with the blood of innocent black Americans. By the end of the week, all 12 men had been swiftly convicted of murder and sentenced to die in the electric chair, their execution scheduled to be carried out in a matter of weeks. The white mob standing outside the courthouse cheered the verdicts, celebrating the fact that the legal system had functioned exactly as they had designed it. They believed the story was finally over, the union was crushed, the black community was traumatized into silence, and the ringleaders were going to be legally executed. But they had completely underestimated the profound resilience of the black community and the absolute relentless determination of those who refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. The terrifying news of the sham trials and the impending executions of the Elaine 12 managed to slip past the heavy censorship of the Arkansas press and reach the desks of courageous black journalists and civil rights organizations in the North. Ida B. Wells, the legendary fearless investigative journalist who had dedicated her entire life to exposing the horrific reality of lynching, immediately recognized the Elaine trials for exactly what they were: illegal lynching designed to completely mask a state-sanctioned massacre. She traveled anonymously into the deeply hostile, dangerous territory of Arkansas, risking her own life to secretly interview the survivors and the families of the condemned men, gathering the horrific, undeniable truth about the torture, the mass murder, and the completely fraudulent trials. She published her findings in a devastating, heavily circulated pamphlet exposing the lies of the Arkansas government to the entire nation and generating a massive wave of public outrage. Simultaneously, the newly formed National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, stepped into the fray, realizing that the Elaine 12 case was a profound, critical turning point in the fight for American civil rights. They knew that if the state of Arkansas was allowed to legally execute 12 innocent men based on torture and mob intimidation, the 14th Amendment guarantee of due process would be completely meaningless for black Americans everywhere. The NAACP immediately launched a massive, desperate fundraising campaign, gathering pennies and nickels from black churches, social clubs, and working-class families across the country to mount a high-stakes legal defense to save the men from the electric chair. They needed a lawyer who was not only brilliant but incredibly brave, a lawyer who could navigate the treacherous, incredibly deadly legal and physical landscape of the Arkansas justice system without getting himself killed in the process. They found exactly that man in Scipio Africanus Jones, a highly respected, completely fearless black attorney from Little Rock, Arkansas. Scipio Jones was a legal genius, a man who had been born into slavery during the Civil War and had risen through sheer intellect and absolute determination to become one of the most prominent, powerful legal minds in the South. When Jones agreed to take on the defense of the Elaine 12, he knew with absolute certainty that he was placing a massive, deadly target directly on his own back. The white power structure in Arkansas was absolutely infuriated that a black lawyer was daring to challenge their carefully constructed legal massacre, and the death threats began pouring into Jones's office immediately. He was warned that if he stepped foot in Phillips County, he would be lynched before he could even reach the courthouse steps. He was told that his home would be burned to the ground and his family would be targeted. The danger was so incredibly severe, so absolutely palpable, that Jones could not even sleep in his own bed. He had to constantly move from house to house every single night, sleeping in the homes of trusted friends and heavily armed supporters, changing his routes and operating entirely in the shadows just to stay alive, while he prepared the legal briefs that would challenge the entire corrupt foundation of the Arkansas justice system. Jones knew that trying to appeal the verdicts within the local state courts of Phillips County was a completely useless, incredibly dangerous endeavor because the local judges were the exact same men who had presided over the sham trials in the first place. His only hope, the only possible path to saving the lives of the 12 condemned men, was to elevate the case out of the corrupted local system and force the federal courts to intervene, a monumental, seemingly impossible legal task, given the Supreme Court's long history of abandoning black Americans to the violent whims of the southern states. Working in absolute secrecy, often late into the night by the dim light of a kerosene lamp while armed men stood guard on the front porch, Jones meticulously drafted a series of brilliant, desperate legal appeals. He argued that the entire trial process in Helena was a complete violation of the United States Constitution because the courtroom had been completely dominated by a violent, heavily armed mob, effectively stripping the defendants of their right to a fair and impartial trial. He argued that the confessions had been extracted through medieval torture, rendering them completely inadmissible in any civilized court of law. He was not just arguing a simple murder case, he was putting the entire violent white supremacist justice system of the Jim Crow South on trial before the federal government. But the clock was ticking relentlessly toward the scheduled execution dates. The state of Arkansas, eager to silence the men and officially close the book on the massacre, was rapidly pushing the paperwork forward, preparing the electric chair and ignoring the mounting national pressure. On multiple incredibly tense, terrifying occasions, the execution dates were only hours away. The condemned men were literally preparing their final prayers. The executioner was standing by to pull the heavy iron switch when Scipio Jones, through sheer legal brilliance and absolutely relentless pressure, managed to secure a last-minute stay of execution from a higher judge, temporarily halting the machinery of death. The psychological toll on the Elaine 12, sitting in their dark isolation cells listening to the clock tick down over and over again, was unimaginable. They were trapped in a terrifying legal limbo, constantly hovering on the razor-thin edge between life and death, completely reliant on a black lawyer who was fighting for his own life on the outside. The legal battle stretched into months, and then into years, an agonizing, incredibly complex war of attrition fought in the courtrooms, the newspapers, and the halls of power. Scipio Jones, facing down hostile white judges, dealing with constant threats of assassination, and navigating the incredibly complex, delicate politics of the NAACP, refused to back down an inch. He slowly, meticulously began to dismantle the state's case, exposing the perjury, exposing the torture, and forcing the federal judiciary to look directly at the horrific, bloody reality of what had actually happened in Phillips County. He managed to secure new trials for some of the men and successfully argued for reduced sentences for others, slowly chipping away at the massive wall of injustice that the state had built around the survivors. But the most profound, earth-shattering legal victory, the moment that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the federal government and the state courts, was still to come. Jones, alongside a brilliant white attorney named George Murphy, prepared to take the case of the remaining condemned men all the way to the highest legal authority in the land, the United States Supreme Court. The case, which would become known to history as Moore versus Dempsey, was not just about saving the lives of the Elaine 12, it was about forcing the federal government to finally honor the absolute broken promise of the 14th Amendment. It was about demanding that the Constitution actually protect black citizens from the violent tyranny of the mob, and it was about proving that the blood spilled in the muddy cotton fields of Arkansas would not be forgotten or ignored by the arc of history.